All right, I have a very special guest with me today. But first, as you know, if you want exclusive early access to interviews just like this, you can join us at the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals, lizwheelershow.com/locals. With me now is Isabel Brown. You wear many hats in this movement, as you yourself said. I'm taking your words. In your capacity today, though, you're a senior ambassador, I believe, with Students for Life.
Yes, I am, and I'm so excited to be here at the National Pro-Life Summit. The energy is just so contagious, and it's really inspiring to see so many members of the next generation speaking up for life.
I was nervous, I'll use that word, before we arrived here because I didn't know how many people would be scared off by the extremely cold temperatures this year at this year's march. Also, though, the vaccine mandate. This has put a cramp on everyone's life, essentially, in DC. You can't go out anywhere in any restaurant unless you have your Vax card here. And a lot of people were worried about that. It doesn't seem to have impacted how many people showed up to this event.
I am so encouraged by the lack of deterrence that I'm seeing from people. I myself am unvaccinated and a student of science. My undergraduate degree was in biomedical sciences, and then I moved here to Washington, D.C. to study the science policy side of things at Georgetown University for my master's degree. It is so shocking to see, by the time I graduated in 2020 to now, just how much the culture of Washington, D.C. alone has changed when it comes to these mandates and whether or not you're following the science, as we often hear from the loudest voices in the room. To go into any restaurant or hotel or public business, you have to show your vaccination card and a photo ID here in our nation's capital, let alone go speak to your representative or make your voice heard in our government.
It's really shocking, actually, that in the capital of the United States of America, you are less free based on a personal medical choice than if you're in the UK, where they just rolled back all of COVID restrictions. This is very interesting. As a student of science, I want to talk to you, wear that hat for a moment. I want to talk to you about this because the idea of what science is, the left has taken over the definition of science, not just taken over the industry of science or the practice of science. They've actually tried to redefine what science is.
They're actively redefining what science is in the moment. And I think that's the scariest part of what we've all experienced, not just as a country, but a world in the last few years. Science, as we all know from our second grade science class, used to be about the pursuit of objective truth. It used to be about asking all the right questions, finding all the data and statistics, and then coming up with a logical conclusion based on the available information out there. But what we've seen in the last few years, particularly from Dr. Fauci, who is the science in his own words.
Yes, he doesn't practice the science, he is the science.
I am the science. What we've seen is that they're coming up with conclusions up front. They're finding data and statistics and narratives to fit that hypothesis, and then they're coming up with this hypothesis to fit their ultimate narrative and their ultimate conclusion. So you're almost coming up with the answer up front. You're forbidding any data that might contradict the narrative from even being released to the public, as we're seeing with this Pfizer data being shut down by the courts. And then if you dare to question any of it, they call you a conspiracy theorist or a domestic terrorist or a science denier. So no longer are we pursuing truth, we're pursuing a political agenda and pursuing a narrative. They're even going so far as to change the definition of an anti-vaxxer in the dictionary, in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, that if you're against vaccine mandates, you are inherently anti-vaccine. It's so disappointing as a scientist for me to see that.
I think there is a word, actually, for what Dr. Fauci practices, but I don't think that word is science. I think that word is fraud.
And propaganda.
It is propaganda because it's very interesting. I mean, the root of science is skepticism. The root of science is challenging, I guess, authority, if you will, not to sound like a rebellious youth, but that is the root of science, is to constantly, like, you don't prove a scientific concept. There are scientific concepts that stand because they cannot be disproved by constant experimentation.
And yet that experimentation is no longer encouraged or even allowed often in our society
and neither
today.
Are the questions.
You accept the narrative, or else you are canceled, and that's very hard to see.
It's very hard to see. Fortunately, I think this weekend particularly, there are a lot of people standing up for the actual science. On college campuses, you work a lot on college campuses. I blame the education system in large part for this. There's, of course, the profiteering pharma companies. There are the corrupt government bureaucrats like Dr. Fauci. There are, the self-interested politicians like Joe Biden and the rest of them. But there's also this idea that some responsibility lies with us, at the American people. Some responsibility lies with us to hold accountable these entities, whether it's in the private sector like pharma, whether it's in the public sector like government officials, public health officials, and politicians. And the American people, I think, have lost the capacity to challenge authority, to think independently, and to disagree with people. And you can make an argument that this starts as early as K through 12, the indoctrination centers, but we know that regardless of what your primary education was, K through 12. Once you get to these very liberal institutions of so-called higher learning, that's completely obliterated, that they simply churn out what I call docile young socialists who won't question the party line. And you work a lot with students at these campuses, and I want to ask you, what's changed in the last 10 years? Because 10 years ago, if a conservative speaker went to a college campus, there were tons of liberals that showed up. They just couldn't wait to try to stump you and ask a question and have that debate. Now, you go to a college campus, whether it's a conservative professor, even a conservative speaker, and the leftists don't show up. They don't even want to have the conversation. What happened?
I think the change is they do show up, but they don't go in the building. They don't engage in that important intellectual back and forth, that debate and discussion that used to be a pinnacle hallmark trait of the college experience. Now they stand outside with Antifa and they hold signs calling you a Nazi or a white supremacist or someone who's going to bring hate to their college campus environment and protest your right to even exist and be there on campus. So for me, that switch really happened on my college campus in real time. I write about that in my book, Frontlines. When I was a sophomore in college in 2016, which was the presidential election that forever changed American culture, and I watched slowly as all of my personal professors in classes like anatomy and organic chemistry and physics stopped talking about science and instead used class time to talk about the southern border wall or why the First Amendment was antiquated and should no longer be a part of American society, or gosh darn it, that orange guy running for president of the United States who is going to be our first white supremacist president. And really the tipping point happened the morning after the 2016 election, where I showed up to all of my classes as a biomedical sciences student and Spanish language minor, and every single one of my professors showed up to class wearing all black with black lace veils draped over their face, bawling their eyes out, saying that we had indefinite extensions on all of our assignments, that we didn't need to take finals, there was free counseling resources available to you just in case you couldn't handle the emotional trauma of a white supremacist being elected to the presidency of the United States. After that, it was a light switch moment on my college campus in particular, where if you remotely disassociated yourself with the left, let alone associated yourself with conservatives and this new movement taking over our country with the dawn of President Trump, you were not welcome on our college campus. You were a murderer, you were a white supremacist, you were anti-immigration, you hated the LGBT community, and students on campus, along with professors and members of the Antifa community in the state of Colorado, where I attended school, did absolutely everything they could to make your life a living hell. So I think really that's where things changed for students in particular. I myself got very frustrated knowing that the limited information people got about the college campus experience happened when a Ben Shapiro or a Milo Yiannopoulos or a Charlie Kirk went to a college campus, and there were huge protests outside that maybe got 5 minutes of coverage on Fox News, but no one ever knew that 9 months later, the students like myself who had invited those people to speak on campus were getting Fs on all their papers. They were being doxxed with their address online, like I experienced with my apartment just off campus, death threats from so many of your classmates and even professors that you took class from. And nowadays, that is the norm for every conservative college student in America, let alone if you're a leader on campus.
It's real. I mean, it's really shocking to hear. It's really shocking to see that transformation. And I think you're correct identifying essentially Trump derangement syndrome.
Exactly.
But I have to take it even a step deeper. I mean, if we think of this like an onion, so we peel back, okay, cancel culture came from Trump derangement syndrome because the left falsely portrayed President Trump to be something that he wasn't. They could not handle this public debate. But go one step deeper than that. What caused them to say, well, what caused them to stop saying, I'd rather try to debunk what you're saying and prove myself to be correct versus you don't have a right to say anything. You are hateful just because you disagree with what I say. What caused that? Who's behind that?
Truthfully, I think that started in the home. And as a country, we no longer talked about two subjects that are now the most controversial, off-limit subjects, even around the family dinner table. And you ask any Gen Zer what you should never talk about with people, they always will in unison say politics and religion. And particularly, that's because our parents failed to have those conversations with us by the time we became adults. Then you're a bright-eyed 18-year-old showing up on your college campus ready to soak in as much knowledge as humanly possible, thinking that you're at an institution of higher education, of higher learning, that you're going to challenge everything you've ever learned. In reality, you are fed a very, very specific list of propaganda from your professors. Keep in mind, I was not a gender studies or ethnic studies or political science student. I was there to become a doctor. I was a biomedical sciences student, and even in those classes was receiving this extreme propaganda from my professors. And most of the people my own age and who are currently on college campuses don't have any reason reason to doubt their professors. We've accepted that these are the experts in the room. We've always held them in high esteem in our society, particularly in education. So there's been no need to question whether or not the truth that they're teaching you is actually rooted in objective truth. Therefore, college campuses are no longer institutions of higher education. It's not about challenging the narratives that you've been taught or learning to think from a new perspective. It's about cranking out as many propaganda-ridden machines in these Gen Z students as possible.
Docile young socialist. It's really shocking. That's where the education argument, of course, goes beyond just liberal colleges and universities and all the way down to K through 12. Because if you show up as this bright-eyed, earnest, eager to learn 18-year-old on a college campus, and you haven't been taught to critically think, you haven't been taught to question authority, you haven't been taught to think for yourself, you haven't been taught anything other than essentially deference to your teachers, let alone how to disagree with someone, meaning how to articulate your arguments, how to not feel emotional if someone challenges you politely or rudely. If you haven't had any of that training, which should happen, I agree, in the family, but you should have had some experience with that just by exposure to differing viewpoints growing up. I think that speaks to our public school system in general, even from a very young age.
In my work with Turning Point USA, we often say that what happens on college campuses never stays on college campuses. And I think as Americans, we've accepted that that means those ideas graduate with you and they affect American culture. They affect corporate boardrooms and the halls of Congress and our nation's cities, as we've literally seen them burn to the ground as people call for a burning of America to make way for the next great thing, socialism. But that also means that those who've graduated as teachers from college campuses take those ideas down to K through 12 learning as well. So we're really seeing that permeate the K through 12 education system, not just in public schools, as many people may misinterpret, but in private schools and charter schools as well. I would be hard pressed to find a parent of a kindergartner or first grader today who has not been exposed to some level of gender identity education or sexual education. And it is absolutely asinine what's happening at such an early age. I mean, we're seeing baby books like Feminist Baby and The Gay BCs and Anti-Racist Baby topping the charts on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. This is so much more mainstream with culture than I think we realize. And we often point to the politics of college campuses, but if we can't get to the root culturally of what's happening to fundamentally change what America is going to look like in the future, I don't know that there's much hope for these K through 12 institutions.
Well, not to wax too philosophical here, but this is the Marxist tactic to undermine the family unit.
Correct.
To overtake the education system. This is what they're doing. We see this. The million-dollar question. Here's the million-dollar question. How do we fix that? How do we fix this crisis of independent thought? How do we fix this crisis where people defer to authority instead of questioning authority? How do we fix this inability to debate one another and, you know, what's happening on college campuses? This generation of kids who go in as kids and come out brainwashed.
I think ultimately it starts with independents daring to be independent in America again today. And when I say independent, I don't mean a political party registration or who you're affiliated to vote with. I mean thinking freely for yourself as an individual, which is a value that we've lost as a nation in totality. I think in the conservative movement, it's especially prominent that people sit on the sidelines and they wait for their favorite influencer or politician or content creator to do the talking for them. But I often say when I speak to older groups with Republican Party fundraisers or college campuses or even high school students here at the National Pro-Life Summit, you can no longer wait for someone else to articulate what you're passionate about and what you value. Because the people that have tens of thousands of followers on social media or get to go on national news or the radio every day have a lot of influence, but the people in their community that these students are experiencing every day on campus or with your family or your church group, those people sit next to you in class or they sit next to you in church. They sit with you around the family dinner table at Thanksgiving. They don't personally know so many of these people with big voices. So it starts with each and every one of us being daring and willing enough to speak out our values loudly, that there's strength in numbers. And we know politics is always downstream from culture. We talked a lot about that today with the Supreme Court decisions that will potentially very significantly change the United States moving forward this year. People listen. And when you have strength in numbers and you have the boldness to speak out your values as an individual, knowing that there will be backlash associated with that, but you forge ahead anyway, I think it inspires so many people to do exactly the same thing.
It does. And a lot of people, you are correct to identify that a lot of people might be afraid of the backlash. Well, let me tell you, I've received a lot of backlash for what I do. It ain't that bad. You can handle it as long as you have a community around you. You got to know that what they say isn't true, whether it's ad hominem insults or even their political accusations. If you know what you believe and you know why you believe what you believe, you will be absolutely fine. Isabel Brown, it was a delight to talk to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and as you know, if you want exclusive early access to interviews just like this, you can join us on the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals. That's lizwheelershow.com/locals.
If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button below, and ring the bell to make sure you never miss a video.